Okay, thank you for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to come to the Nordic countries. I quite often come and I enjoy it every time. Okay, let's move on. From the earlier presentation this afternoon, we found that there are some commonalities in the Nordic approach, as we see here. The socio-pedagogical tradition, play, relationships and curiosity emphasized, building on children's interest, a holistic approach, resisting school preparation approach, that is resisting schoolification. I sometimes, when I listen to the Nordic countries talk about schoolification, I sometimes think it reminds me of the way when I had my children and when I was a child myself, people would say, "No, if you do that, the boogeyman will get you." You know, sometimes it seems that schoolification is like the boogeyman for the Nordic countries. Okay, and opposing formal learning standards too. So, okay, yes, I agree with those things, and they give these key areas and challenges, which, as I said in my discussion, seem to be actually challenges which are very common across most countries, actually, certainly most Western countries. But they came to the conclusion that quality is a central topic in every country and in every dimension: administration, daily practices, and research. So I'm going to say a little bit about quality. And they said that professional development was a growing need for highly qualified teachers. I'm going to say a little bit about professional development as well. Now, these two aspects, quality and professional development, are central to any attempt to improve pedagogy. Okay. Now, these are some of the characteristics of Nordic pedagogy which I have gleaned from the literature. A holistic approach over an academic approach, child-centered and holistic, oppose standards for learning early because the standards may limit the child's free development. It is considered unnecessary and almost harmful to introduce school readiness too early. This would clash with the Nordic value of the good childhood, where ECEC must practice democracy and children are active participants and have a voice in their own everyday life. That's a quote from the Committee on the Rights of the Child back in 1989. So this is quite a long-standing approach. In Norway's curriculum, they specify that barnehage should be built on a holistic philosophy with care, play and learning at the core of activities. The strategy has to contribute to children's development of social interaction, language and communication skills, and the learning process includes play as having content in itself as well as an educational method. The values of responsibility, egalitarianism, freedom of mind and tolerance are explicitly mentioned in the curriculum, and so is student participation, meaning that adults have to use children's views in planning. However, another article by a Nordic researcher, group of researchers, Uström, argued that there's an international shift influencing the Nordic countries towards a learning paradigm. The Nordic countries have often opposed introducing formal learning standards too early in children's lives because of the risk of limiting free development. According to Uström et al., these new tendencies are challenging core values such as free play and free development. Now, when I talk to people in the Nordic countries, it seems to me there is a big division in the approach to ideas about formal learning standards. Amongst the politicians and some of the policymakers, there is a move and a desire to move in that direction. But amongst the profession, virtually no desire to move in that direction. It does seem to be a tension between the politicians and policymakers and the profession in respect to this kind of debate that Uström draws our attention to. Now, let's think a bit more carefully about what is pedagogy. Pedagogy is different to the curriculum. The curriculum sets out a framework for what you'd like your children to experience and develop. And in that sense, represents your ideal. Okay? Pedagogy is actually not the ideal, it's actually what happens. Pedagogy relates to the how and practice of educating. Pedagogy is what a teacher does to influence learning. And to quote one of my colleagues, Iram Siraj, is a set of instructional techniques and strategies which enable learning to take place and provide opportunities for the acquisition of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and dispositions within a particular social and material context. It refers to the interactive process between the teacher and learner and the learning environment. It's that last sentence which I think captures the very essence of pedagogy, the interactive environment and between teacher and learner and the nature of the learning environment. For example, an example of pedagogy. With numeracy, a pedagogical practice might encourage counting ingredients while you're cooking with the children, or jointly counting pages after reading a story they have enjoyed. Okay, so that is, you can introduce pedagogical strategies into everyday activities. Okay. Now, international studies show that children's capabilities are shaped by the quality and range of early experiences and interactions in both the home and the ECEC environment. Now, experiences of young children in ECE settings is essentially what we call process quality, the nature of the interactions between ECE staff and children, the interactions between peers, and also their interactions with the environment. So relevant experiences include age-appropriate behavior towards children and domain-specific stimulation in important areas of development. These interactions and experiences are significant factors explaining the effects of ECEC on children's learning and development. Okay. Now, interactions between adults and children are vital for early learning. A phrase I'm going to say to you several times today, and if you don't remember anything else today, remember this: interactions drive development. That's the core of what we should be focusing on. In high-quality interactions, adults are genuinely interested in what the child is doing. Adults are listening, are helping to extend children's thoughts and knowledge, and implement what we call sustained shared thinking. This is a concept developed by my colleague Iram Siraj to describe a particularly rich form of interactive dialogue between children and staff, whereby the staff scaffold the interaction to enable the child's capacities to come to their highest level of development. In settings where such sustained shared thinking was more common, children make greater developmental progress. In one of our studies, which I'm going to tell you about, this came through fairly consistently, where we found centers which were particularly effective in advancing children's academic progress and their social and emotional development. We found this sustained shared thinking was common, but in centers where the development across the whole range of abilities and dispositions wasn't so apparent, it was more or less absent. It was a very clear distinguishing feature. So, and now learning through play, which I see emphasized over and over again in the Nordic countries. For example, in one of the requests the OECD made to member countries for what they saw as should be focused on in ECEC progress and recommendations in the Starting Strong reports, consistently that phrase, learning through play, came through from the Nordic country responses. And it's a highly effective way of enhancing children's development. With the way sensitive adults help children reflect on situations through scaffolding, for example, is important. By scaffolding, it's where a practitioner helps a child with tasks that are just beyond the child's current level of ability or child's current level of development. And it can have greater effects on children's development than teacher-directed or child-centered environments. So, if you structure the environment so that the child is just a little bit beyond what the child is currently capable of, the child can move forward and learn the new capacity, be it in the social sphere, the emotional sphere, or the cognitive sphere. However, if it's too far in advance, the child doesn't profit at all. And therefore, effective scaffolding requires a good knowledge of child development and a good knowledge of individual children's capabilities. Because if you don't have a good knowledge of child development and a good knowledge of individual children's capabilities, you cannot scaffold adequately. Okay, and pedagogy should be neither too staff-directed or staff-focused with a high share of staff-initiated activities or too child-centered where children decide on the activities. And I'll come back to that point at the very end. Okay. Now, pedagogy in ECEC matters because when children enter the primary school, their cognitive, language, pre-reading or literacy, numeracy, social, and emotional skills already differ quite fundamentally in ways which are going to have long-term consequences for those children. And those skills are partly influenced by ECEC. They're also influenced by the home and a range of other factors, but ECEC does make a difference. And these differences then are typically maintained right through later development. And I have a whole host of studies at the bottom there which give you evidence along those lines. Okay, now the quality of pedagogy in Nordic countries is often assumed to be high. That is, people sort of look up to the Nordic model. The Nordic model is much more heavily resourced than other countries. They have more trained teachers. In fact, from what I heard this morning, actually that's not true. 35% trained staff is about what we have in England. Okay, but anyway, for all of these reasons, it's held up as being high. Is it? Is it actually as high as people think? Now, we've already said that some people have had qualms that quality is not quite so universally high as they would like it to be. Well, in Norway, a group of researchers have been doing a study where they've been using some international measures of measuring quality, like the ITAs. Now, this is for children 0 to 3 years of age, okay? And the ITAs has various subscales, and it's measured on a scale where 1 is inadequate, 3 is barely minimally adequate, 5 is good, and 7 is excellent, okay? That's the idea. So it's a 1 to 7 scale. And they use this scale in 206 Norwegian centers with children 0 to 3. And they found an average score of 3.9. That is above minimal, but still a long way short of good. Okay? This is the distribution of scores they saw. A big clustering around that middle, with only about 9 to 10% scoring what could be considered as definitely good. And 13% were actually below minimal. Now, this is not a particularly good story, okay? Now, you could argue the ITAs is an originally American instrument, but it's been used extensively in many countries. And in Sweden, there are many, many studies using the ITAs. Okay, what did they also find? They found that qualifications of staff mattered. When they looked at qualified staff versus non-qualified staff, they found that ITAS scores were generally, across the board, better for the qualified staff than the unqualified staff, no matter which subscale of the ITAS they looked at. When they looked at staff-child ratios, they found that when the ratio was more favorable, again, the ITAS scores were better. When they looked at group composition, there were two major kinds of groups they found. Some of these groups were quite small and didn't change very much in composition. Other groups were much larger, and within the group, the actual composition of the group would change from day to day, and even actually within a day. And what they found was, with the more stable groups, you got higher ITAS scores than with less stable groups, right? And if you had small, stable groups versus big, more flexible groups, you clearly got better scores. Look at these ones here in the blue, for the small, stable groups than for the bigger, more flexible groups. Okay. And if we look at some data across different countries, Norway, 3.9. The UK in 2005, 5.4. Oh, wow. Then UK back in 2012 were very similar to Norway. The difference between that is in those intervening years, there was a massive push towards professional development. Netherlands, only 3. Portugal, 2.8. Brazil, 2.5. So on international standards, Norway is not doing as bad as some countries, but it's still, you couldn't say it was doing brilliantly. Okay, let's look at another kind of way of looking at quality. This time, the caregiver interaction profile, which has been developed in the Netherlands, okay, and measures in particular interactional skills in children up to the age of 4. What do we find? Again, it's scored on a similar kind of scale where 1 is inadequate, 7 is excellent, 5 is about good, and 4's not so bad. 3 is and below is not so good either. Okay, and it looks at these different aspects of interactions, care aspects and educational aspects. What do we find? Well, across 168 caregivers in groups with toddlers, they found an average score of 3.7. Again, not brilliant. Plenty of room for improvement. So, summing up, the quality of interactions in EEC in Norway, and I suspect Norway is not dramatically different in this respect to other Nordic countries, is moderate. The caregiver score is, by the way, sorry, I should say one thing. The studies I've just talked about were by Elisabeth Bonestad and Ellen Oss of the University College of Oslo and Akershus. The caregiver scores are higher on particular aspects of on basic aspects of interactions. But respect for autonomy and structure and limit setting are the only aspects that reach adequate level. The scores for educational aspects of interactions are particularly low. The differences between teachers and assistants are comparatively small. You might say this is a situation that calls for action. Okay, so how do we improve pedagogy? This phrase again, interactions drive development. If you're thinking about how to improve pedagogy, this is what you need to focus on, interactions. Interactions both in the home, parenting, and what we call the home learning environment, and in ECEC, the quality of ECEC, have effects on developmental outcomes. And the effects in the early years for language development and self-regulation seem particularly important for long-term outcomes, and suggest that interactions fostering language development and self-regulation are particularly important aspects of quality in early childhood education and care that we should focus on in pedagogy. If we look at children's level of language development at the start of school, and this is not just an immigrant, non-immigrant issue, it's true within monolingual communities, predicts literacy most of the way through the school system. Catherine Snow works at Harvard shows this, for example. And it has language development has consequences for socio-emotional development. A 3-year-old child who can't express itself gets frustrated. Because it gets frustrated, it gets aggressive. So there are knock-on consequences. And it's no accident that if you look at your prison populations, you'll find the illiteracy level in your prison populations is particularly high. That's not an accident. Okay. Self-regulation, I'll talk a little bit about more of this, its ability to control behavior and plan behavior and so on, both emotionally and cognitively. Okay. Now, in understanding why these aspects of development are so important, I'm just going to give you a little bit of neurology, just a very little bit. You may not like it, but it's good for you. Okay. Now, everything we do, feel, and say from infancy to the end of lives reflects the functioning of our brain. If you remember anything I tell you today, it'll be because a few synapses in your brain have formed and they've stayed there later on. If somebody kicks you in the head and they fall apart, then you forget about it. But so your brain controls everything you do. Okay. At birth, we have 100 billion neurons, and that's more or less all you get. But what happens is the junctions, the synapses connections between these neurons increase rapidly in the early years. And most connections are made in the first year. To give you an illustration of how important this is in development, 60% of the nutrition received by a child in the first year of life goes towards forming these synaptic connections. By age 3, 80% of synaptic connections are made. And then we get this phenomenon of pruning of synapses. That is a saying which I think is applicable throughout life. Use it or lose it. A synapse forms, if it gets strengthened by experience, it's kept. If it doesn't get strengthened by experience, it drops out. Okay? And synapses decline to age 10. And synapse development influences brain plasticity, that is, change in brain functioning as a result of experience. And this capacity to change functioning as a result of experience declines with age, because the capacity for forming synapses declines with age. Okay, let me illustrate this from some anatomy. This is an area of the brain at birth, and you see some neurons, but hardly any synapses between the neurons. The same area of the brain when the child's 2 years of age, masses of synapses. The same area of the brain when the child's 6 years of age. Quite a lot of synapses, but a lot less than we're at 2. The reason for that is the brain forms synapses to allow maximum capacity for learning. If that learning is supported by experiences, the synapses are kept. If it's not supported by experiences, the synapses drop out. So the reason it's much less at 6 years is only some of those synapses got supported by experiences, and those are the ones which are kept. Okay? Now, if we look at synapse development by age, 0 is birth there, so we're going from before birth. Then we've got 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year of age, 4 years of age, 8 years of age, 12 years of age, 16 years of age. And we see for vision and hearing, you get maximum synapse development very shortly after birth, which falls off over the first year of life. Then for language development, we get a maximum number of synapses around 9 months of age, which then fall off to about 4 years of age. For higher cognitive functioning, like reasoning, we get a maximum number of synapses around about 3 to 4 years of age, and then they fall off towards adolescence. Let's look at the language line now, the blue line. If you look at that line and you see, oh, maximum synapses at 9 months of age. Oh, that's when maximum learning is taking place. No, it's not. Maximum learning is taking place in that fall-off period, because that's when the synapses are being kept if they're reinforced by experience, and dropping out if they're not reinforced by experience. So the brain is adopting the strategy, the child is prepared at 9 months of age to learn any language in the world, any word that might exist or be created, or any language that might be, the child is capable of learning all of those things. But of course, what happens in reality? The child is only experiences maybe one language or 2 languages and so on. And so it's only the sound structure and the grammar, etc., of the languages the child hears, which correspond to the synapses that are supported and are kept, and the other ones drop out. And this is one of the reasons why language learning in very early childhood is very much easier than language learning much later on. Okay, so that period between 9 months and 4 years is particularly critical for language development. It's also a period when ECEC staff have a lot of time with children. So I want to underpin the importance of a child's language development. Language development underpins cognitive, educational, and social development. And a child with poor language at 3 years will be at risk unless intervention is taken. It's still possible at 3 years, if you pick up a child with poor language, to bring it up to a normal level, because there's still that plasticity there. Leave it till 5, and you've missed your opportunity. It's too late. Yeah. You can produce some changes later on, but you've missed a huge opportunity. Let me illustrate this with a well-known study from Hart and Risley in America. What Hart and Risley did, they picked out a sample of children in families living on welfare, extremely deprived families, very poorly educated. Then we have a group of very ordinary working class families, with employment, but not particularly highly educated, but not uneducated either. Then we have a group of families who are from professional homes, where very highly educated parents. And what they did for the first 4 years of life is they took samples of the language heard by the child by attaching a microphone to the child's clothing and a remote recorder of the language heard every day for those children over the first 4 years of life. And they worked out that the average child in the welfare home had heard about 12 million words by the time it was 4 years old. In the working class home, it was about 25 million words. And in the professional home, it was 42 million words. So the gap between the child in the professional home and the welfare home is 30 million words. Now, if you give one child 30 million words more experience than another child, what's going to happen? Well, this is the vocabulary scores of these children over the first 36 months of life. As you can see, the red line's the professional homes, the blue line's the working class homes, and the green line's the welfare homes. So we see very clearly that there are implications of just the sheer experience of language on early language development. I did a study in the 1980s in London where we looked at various aspects of interactions in a variety of environments. In the home, when the child was cared for by relatives, when the child was cared for by a childminder, and when the child was in a day nursery. And what we found was that language development was linked to the quality of care, and in particular, the particular aspect of quality care was most related to was the sheer number of communications the child received and the amount of responsiveness to the adults to the child's communications were particularly important. And these effects persisted until the end of the study. The study ended when they were 6 years old. And we also found that the stability of care was closely linked with the quality of care. Where the child had many changes of caregiver, the quality of care was much lower. So what Hart and Risley demonstrated in the home environment also applies in ECEC environments. Now, what about long-term effects of ECEC generally? Well, we have the well-known EPSI study in the UK of over 3,000 children. And I'm going to rush through this because you probably have heard this before. At the start of school, we find that the quality of ECEC in the children have received affects these children. So green is low quality, red is average quality, and blue is high quality. And this is where they've had ECEC over children with no ECEC at all, the zero group. So this is the months of developmental advantage the children show at the start of school. And some of our children had 2 to 3 years of ECEC experience, and some only had 1 to 2 years experience. So the duration and the quality made a difference in those children's development at the start of school. I'm showing you literacy scores there. I could have shown you social development scores, and you'd find similar pattern. Okay? Now, we also found that particular preschools were particularly effective in boosting children's development. So what we then did is we did qualitative case studies of a sample of particularly effective centres and a group of not so effective centres. But we didn't tell the researchers which were the effective centres. Okay? The researchers went in and spent some time in these centres observing what happened in the centres, interviewing the staff, interviewing the parents, and basically building up a picture of what daily life was like for children in these centres. And when they brought that data back to the lab, we then said, okay, these were the effective, these were the ineffective. Let's have a look at your case study notes to see if we can extract what's differentiating the effective from the ineffective centres. And 5 areas were particularly important. The quality of adult-child verbal interactions. Again, this language development coming through. The knowledge and understanding of the curriculum. How well the staff understood what it was that they were meant to be doing with the children. The knowledge of how young children learn. Knowledge of child development. Adult skill in supporting children in resolving conflict, so helping their social development there. But also helping parents to support children's learning at home. This is something we overlook when we talk about training of ECEC staff. ECEC staff should be skilled in working with parents. this is particularly important for children from disadvantaged homes, because they can, and not only in disadvantaged homes, ordinary homes as well, because parents often are struggling to deal with the challenges of bringing up children, and sometimes the help of ECE staff can help them in their task. Now, we found that there were long-term effects of these ECE experiences on these children. For example, at age 11, every child in the country takes the same standard assessment in literacy and numeracy. And I'm just going to draw your attention to having allowed for income, mother's education, father's education, socio-economic status, home learning environment, and also the quality of the primary school the children have, there's a distinct effect for high-quality preschools. So going on from a high-quality preschool versus no preschool has a big effect on numeracy and also has a strong effect on literacy. So those effects are apparent even till age 11. There are other bigger effects, of course, like mother's education and the home learning environment, but the preschool effects are very significant. It wasn't just for academic outcomes, when we looked at social outcomes as well, like self-regulation or pro-social behavior, empathy, sharing behavior, we found that the quality of the preschool that children had attended was predictive of differences in these social development measures at age 11 and at age 14. And when the children were 16, every child in the country takes similar assessments, again on literacy and numeracy and other measures as well. And we're seeing that this preschool effect here is still being maintained at age 16. This is 11 years after they left the preschool. These are long-term effects. Okay. So, conclusions. From age 2, all children benefited from preschool. The quality of preschool matters. Part-time has equal benefits to full-time. Preschool effects persist at least until the teenager, and I'll show you evidence that shows it goes through to the adult years as well. High-quality preschool can protect the child from the effects of a low-effective school. We found that those children who went to very high-quality preschools were less affected by poor teaching in the primary school than children who went to low-quality preschool, as if they've been taught the capacity to learn and to learn independently. And therefore, if the teacher wasn't so good, they still learned pretty well. We also see some effects, primary school effects, and we also saw some very strong secondary school effects, but that's another story, not for today. Okay, now these results are consistent with other international evidence. In Norway and France and Switzerland, people have used register data on the whole population to look at where there's been a gradual introduction of preschool education into the country and to look at the long-term effects of those children who had preschool education versus those who didn't. And in all of these countries, we find that preschool increased education, employment, and incomes later on. In Denmark, there's a very nice study by Bachmüller which linked together the registered data on preschools and preschool staff with the registered data on the children and their parents, and was able to work out that those children, regardless of social background, who went to the higher quality preschools, as measured by staff qualifications and experience, had better outcomes at age 16 than equivalent children who went to preschools which didn't have such high quality. And also in Northern Ireland, we find high-quality preschool increased grades in English by 2.4 times. That is, you were 2.4 times more likely to get a high grade if you went to high-quality preschool than if you didn't go to preschool at all, and 3.4 times more likely to get a high grade in maths. So these are pretty substantial effects. So the gains from high-quality ECEC are in terms of educational achievement, special education, behavior problems, employment, earnings and welfare in adulthood, smoking, drug use and depression, which in turn leads to decreased cost of government schooling, social service, crime and healthcare costs. So and those people who've done cost-benefit analyses tell us that the savings due to these improvements outweigh the costs to government of providing the high-quality ECEC. Okay. So the early years are very important, and preschool is part of the infrastructure for a successful society. But I don't need to tell you that because you all have effectively integrated preschool into your infrastructure. That's not true of every country. High-quality preschool boosts development. Parenting is also very important. Don't forget that. Parenting is very important, and therefore working with parents should be part of the training of preschool teachers. But preschool lifts the whole population curve. Everybody benefits. What we found in our study was those children from very advantaged homes showed a benefit from high-quality preschool. The benefit for the children from disadvantaged homes was bigger, but everybody showed some benefit. Okay. Now, using the same data from this study, I want to talk about the role of non-cognitive skills in educational outcomes. Non-cognitive skills are individual attributes that are not derived from cognitive ability, like things like social skills or personality. In other words, aspects which are one of the primary foci of ECEC in Nordic countries. And in our study, we had measures of self-regulation, sociability, cooperation, antisocial and worry behavior, pro-social behavior, openness or confidence. And we measured these at the start of school at age 5. And we looked at, allowing for all the background factors, would these abilities of the child at age 5 predict longer-term outcomes? What did we find? Well, what we found was only self-regulation had effects on longer-term outcomes. This is a child's ability to regulate behavior and emotions and plays a role in becoming a competent individual. The learning of this ability starts early in life, and children become capable of thinking before acting, controlling their anger or the need to cry, and it involves conscious and unconscious processes. For an example of the data, when we looked at children at 5 or at age 10 on their literacy scores, we found that a whole range of factors, like various types of ethnicity factors and gender and the whole learning environment, affected whether they were doing better than we expected on the basis of their social background. But what we found had the biggest effect of all in predicting higher outcomes was self-regulation. Okay? Very powerful effect. More powerful than almost anything else we looked at. So that indicates that if you can improve a child's self-regulation at the start of school, there are going to be long-term consequences of that. And self-regulation is very open to the kinds of experiences you provide in ECEC. By the end of the preschool years, a well-regulated child can wait for a turn, resist the temptation to grab a desired object from another child, clean up after a play period with little or no adult prompting, willingly help another child or adult with a task, and persist with a challenging activity. So, such children also actively try to control negative emotion, often by talking to themselves, "I'll get a chance soon," or changing their goals when one activity is possible, turning to another. This is a quote from an American researcher called Burke in one of her textbooks. And it illustrates the characteristics of the child with high self-regulation. And I think you may recognize those characteristics of some of the children you've worked with. And you'll also recognize some of your children don't show those characteristics. Self-regulation difficulties are typically present in 30% of children starting school. So there's ample room for improvement. When we analyzed what influenced self-regulation in our data, we found a whole range of demographic factors like age, gender, birth weight, siblings, poverty, parent education, socioeconomic status will influence self-regulation. But in addition to those background factors, the home learning environment, the kinds of learning opportunities in the home was a big factor influencing self-regulation. Preschool quality influenced self-regulation, and preschool duration also affected self-regulation. So that suggests that the ECEC environment has a very clear effect on self-regulation. And here are the effects of self-regulation at age 10. The home children, children in low quality, went to low quality preschools, children went to medium quality preschools, and children went to high quality preschools. So you can see that the children went to medium or high quality are clearly more advanced in their self-regulation skills. Okay. Again, this phrase, interactions drive development. Okay, I'm just repeating what I said earlier because I just want to get that message over and over to you. And I'm just hoping that if I repeat it enough, those synapses will not fade away. Okay, now I'm going to suggest a model to you for thinking about how ECEC can influence child development in the longer term. Language development and self-regulation, as I said, affect educational outcomes like literacy, numeracy, and other things, but they also affect socio-emotional development, empathy, pro-social behavior, sharing, etc. Those social skills that we want to promote. But these are affected in turn by the home learning environment. Child characteristics like temperament and gender, and other aspects of home, and also critically, from our point of view, interactions in the preschool and preschool experience clearly affects language development and self-regulation. So that suggests that if we can make sure that we're providing the right kind of experiences, the right kind of interactions to foster language development and self-regulation, then we are going to improve children's capacities, not only in the educational sphere, but in the social and emotional sphere as well. Okay? In other words, we're going to make these people more whole individuals. Okay? So in that sense, language development and self-regulation are particularly important. How are we doing for time?
Half an hour.
Okay, that's okay. Fine. So, how to improve ECEC pedagogy? This suggests an increased focus in ECEC staff professional development on fostering language development and self-regulation would be a good way forward in improving ECEC pedagogy. Now, how well do you think your staff know about techniques to improve language development and self-regulation? My guess is it wouldn't be very many of your staff, because typically that's true. It's one of the reasons we've found that when we provided professional development for staff in interactional styles and interactional techniques and play techniques which foster the child's capacity to learn language by scaffolding the experiences to suit the child's level of development, both in terms of language, acquiring language development and acquiring self-regulation skills, that these professional development then have consequences for the children. So this is clearly a way forward. Now, we've talked about learning through play as part of Nordic pedagogy. Now, learning through play is actually more complicated than it first seems. You can think of a completely unstructured environment. Staff sit back, children do whatever they like. Completely unstructured activities. Okay? Play without much adult support. Then at the other extreme, you could have, if you like, a highly schoolified environment where children are sort of sat down and the staff direct every moment of the child's activities. Okay, that's one extreme. Now, play, and in between these we have what might be called focused learning, where we have adult-guided play, and then we have more child-initiated play, but with some adult support. So we're moving along a continuum here. If we look at the research evidence of instructional techniques which vary along that continuum, what we find is, at this end of the extreme, we seem to get poor learning. At this end of the extreme, we also seem to get poor learning, primarily through poor motivation. But we get higher levels of learning when we have this adult involvement in the play experiences, either through the adult maybe suggesting a play activity for the child, or where the child starts an activity, the adult can scaffold the environment to better enable that play experience to go forward. So the child, for example, the child starts a jigsaw puzzle, and the child's doing quite well, gets 6 or 7 pieces together, and then gets stuck. Oh, and you can say, oh, why don't we look for the ones which are blue? Do they go together? You know, you give a little hint. And then that takes the child forward. And the child's got the idea, hang on, look for common characteristics. You know, the child's moving forward. Then then you can say, oh, look for the ones with a straight edge. And and so you move, you're moving the child's conceptual structure forward through little hints, but the child's initiating the activity. And that's a very simple example. And I can give much more complicated examples, but it illustrates the ways in which interactions are fundamental to the child's learning of cognitive abilities, learning of language abilities, learning of social abilities, and learning of emotional skills as well. And somebody asked a question earlier on, how does a child learn empathy? Or the question was, how do you teach empathy? That was a question on the board. Well, empathy is an example of a social skill. And people learn social skills through a variety of types of experience. One of them is observational learning. That is, if you see the staff member showing empathy, you start to realize, the child starts to realize there's something there. You mentioned earlier acting out, playing a game, doctors and nurses, mums and dads, shopkeeper and customer, and playing out those games also helps empathy. So modeling for children social skills and providing play opportunities to practice those social skills are very clear ways where you can structure the environment to enable those skills to develop. So you don't sit the clown at the class and say, right, empathy is when you feel what the other child's feeling. No, you structure it so that the child comes to learn that by capitalizing on the spontaneous skills and capacities and capabilities within the child and allowing those to develop. So when I think about the Nordic emphasis on learning through play, I continually feel a need to say, it's not just any play. You have to think clearly about how to structure that play to capitalize on the child's inherent developmental tendencies and also the child's inherent interests. Because play is a very potent form of learning when you're a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old, or I can tell you now, when you're a 60-year-old. Play is one of the most efficient forms of mechanisms for learning. But it's just completely unstructured play is a comparatively, by itself, inefficient form of learning, although it can provide a very good basis for exploratory activities and trying out new things. But if that's all that happens, then there are many aspects of learning which won't take place. And I have a feeling that the reason we were finding such low quality scores that I showed earlier in the Norwegian study is that staff were using the philosophy of learning through play. As long as the children are playing, I don't need to interact so much. Maybe I'm being too critical here, but I sometimes feel that that's happening. You can use that philosophy as an excuse for lack of involvement with the children. And therefore, you need to realize that play is not a unitary thing. It has many dimensions to it. And the characteristics of the play will affect the nature of the child's development in terms of their emotional, social, and cognitive development. Okay. There's a whole list of references. You can look up the work if you wish to. But I think I'll stop there and leave the floor open for questions.
Thank you.